Sifu is a game about revenge. The plot setup is simple, but the story is subversive. You play as this guy called Yang, and you kung fu a guy to death before you find a kid in a closet, and the game is like choose your character, and it turns out this kid is actually the protagonist. This kid then gets killed by a machete guy, but lives because of a funny talisman. There's this sick intro where you kill all 5 of the game's bosses within like a minute, and then there's a time skip, and the goal of the game is to take down each of these 5 guys who were involved in your father's death. As you progress through the game, it becomes increasingly clear that the protagonist is unjustified in their quest to avenge their father, but you also encounter progressively more surreal events that make a decreasing amount of sense as you advance through each of the game's 5 hideouts. What no one else seems to acknowledge is that the supernatural stuff in this game cannot be explained by its just kung fu magic. The bizarre imagery and occurrences you find across the game's narrative invite questions as to what the hell is going on, not just because they're supernatural, but because they are illogical within the game's plot. They're entirely unexplainable. That is, unexplainable by all but one reading, that many of the events of the game exist only within the protagonist's mind. The protagonist is delusional or unreliable, and they are presenting a meta-narrative. The supernatural events of the game are created by the protag to benefit their own wider narrative that their vengeance is justified. Sifu's story is great because it gets the player to gradually question not only the protagonist's morality, but also their sanity. Welcome back to the Alpha C channel. Thanks to this person on screen for the footage, and this is a postmodern reading of First on our list is Fajar, the guy who killed the protag at the start of the game, causing them to revive using the talisman. The first hideout is great at setting comfortable expectations that the protag is just beating up bad people and isn't doing much out of what the player would anticipate to avenge their father. The first enemies in the game are gangsters and junkies, not exactly the most respectable people, and at this point in the game it's mostly left ambiguous as to whether you're killing them or just knocking them out. We wouldn't believe that our protagonist would seriously kill droves of people just to get revenge, right? Not at this stage we wouldn't. And hey, they're trying to kill us too. There are places where you can throw enemies off ledges, which would give them quite the impact to say the least, but considering the game just started, the player likely hasn't learned how to do that yet. The game is designed in such a way that you don't see much blood at this stage. The protag's narrative surrounding their enemies is told by making use of a great concept called the detective board, where the protag arranges anything they collect and writes up notes about it. It's the only thing that lets us hear what the protag has to say outside of dialogue options, therefore it's also the only form of introspection we get from them. The notes that the protag writes on the detective board ensure us that their enemies are dealing with dirty money and apparently blood money too. You don't have a reason to doubt the protag or to believe that the people that they're fighting could be at all good at this point. At the end of the hideout, we find Fajar, who has the surprising supernatural ability to make a plant grow with his hands. It's not too out of the ordinary, we do have a death-defying talisman after all, but it nonetheless feels a little jarring. In his second phase, he turns the entire warehouse into a forest using his power, which might be surprising, but the explanation of kung fu magic suffices at this point in the game. Fajar is mute by the way, and we don't get an explanation as to why. Maybe it was trauma, we don't know. We don't know what his motives for the attack 8 years ago were either, or whether he's changed his ways, but either way, we still have revenge to take.
I have spent 8 long years preparing for this.
Slicing his head off is the first thing we can be sure is a gruesome death caused by a protag. Is it really right to kill him in revenge, even if he's a murderer? The player might ask this by this point, but it's not particularly surprising action from the protag. The second hideout is a club. One must ask why we would smack groups of people in the face with a bat who were just chilling in a club. The villainy of our enemies is decreased in the second hideout, though they are participating in an event called the Burning, where people engage in violence and physically harm each other. It's a blood sport. They also do things like bet on fights here, so it's certainly at least a little unsavory. As we enter through this door though, the lights go out before... Where are we? Surrounded by buildings from a different age with fire all around, it appears as though by stepping through a door in the club, we've entered a portal to a different location. This is the first real shock that comes to the player, and at this point you might come up with a few different explanations. Is this more magic? Is the club just next to some old buildings? Maybe you really did step through a portal. An NPC involved in running the burning also has a great response to one of your dialogue options.
Your master's mind is broken. He will drag you and all the others down into the abyss.
Look around you. You don't look so different to me. If you didn't want to fight, why did you come this far?
This is the first time where a character in the game has questioned the protagonist's morality. The burning is an event of violence, no doubt, but is the protagonist any worse? This question encourages them and you to think about the ethics of this quest of revenge. Flipping back and forth between these burning buildings and the rest of the club, it makes it clear that something is going on here. This isn't just the way the club is built, it's either magic or a secret third thing. We beat up Sean, not much else to say about that. This brings us to a true turning point in the game's narrative, imagery, and gameplay: the museum. At this point, we're fighting people who have done literally nothing wrong, except for one person, Kuroki, who associated with people who killed your father. But other than that, is now just an artist. In this hideout, the gameplay mechanics are a significant contributor to increasing the level of violence of the protagonist, used to make the player question them. The first enemy you fight is a knife, which means you yourself can get access to that knife by taking it from them. And naturally, visual blood and you takedown animations leave no ambiguity as to whether you're killing people. Later into the hideout, there's a hole with a knife at the start, and the hole is white. The environment and gameplay is designed around controlling what the player sees to tell its story. Throughout this hideout, we get dialogue from enemies telling us that Kuroki has stopped her violent ways, and telling the protagonist to stop their quest of vengeance. At this point, the protagonist has gone mask off, the game has gone mask off. It's clear that the player character is in the wrong. Kuroki is said to be at the top of the museum. When we get there, we can walk on thin air. This is the first example of something that seems logically unusual, but oh boy is there more to come. At the center is a waterfall, which walking into brings you to some kind of dark void room. How did we get here? What's going on? It definitely seems like something's up at this point. Speakers somewhere give us a lecture about water and its cleansing abilities, and this is significant as it's a point in the story where the protagonist could have turned back and repented. Later on, we'll find that Kuroki does not want to fight at all, and pleads that the protagonist ends their rampage before the fight begins. But naturally, this does not happen. Perhaps they believe that they are too far gone. They could have cleansed themselves, but they reject that opportunity. Once all enemies in the void room are defeated, a door of light opens, allowing us to progress into further rooms. And we pass through normal halls, but then an ice cave, and eventually we fall through the floor into red and blue void rooms, with the hideout finishing in a snowy forest with mountains around. It should be clear that walking through the top of a museum and ending up here should be completely impossible. But there's still plenty more of the plot and imagery of this hideout to analyze. Firstly, the literal first thing that happens in the hideout is guards preparing for the protagonist's arrival. They could have easily just all gone to one place to fight the protagonist, because there's no way they'd win by themselves against several dozen. This also begs the question of how the protagonist is able to fight any size of group of bodyguards or trained fighters. Then the protagonist states on the detective board that Kuroki is at the top of the museum, but of course we have to go through way more once we've made it there. Come to think of it, why would Kuroki be working on a project at the top of the museum? One must ask, is any of this real? The events that happen when we get to the waterfall are positively bizarre, and we end our museum visit in a forest somehow. Were we ever in a museum to begin with? It's by clinging onto a semblance of logic and realism that the game makes the player want to believe what they're seeing, but by slowly introducing cracks into the protagonist's reality, the game makes them question, it makes them think. Should we believe the narrative we're being fed? Before arriving at Kuroki, these void rooms had statues that came to life, and an exhibition that depicted kung fu and violence. This isn't the work of Kuroki, it's the work of the protagonist's mind. This is their psyche given form. The imagery of the game, the art of this museum, it reflects the protagonist's thoughts. Kung fu, violence, vengeance. We have our doubts about the story, and the protagonist has their doubts about themselves. And so, we now face Kuroki, who offers peace to the protagonist, and yet they fight on. After defeating phase 1 of this huge difficulty spike boss, the scene shifts entirely, as does our opponent's appearance, which is linked to something else within the lore. There's no turning back now. We stab her in the heart with our own weapon and move on to the next hideout. The penultimate hideout is of Jinfang, a CEO who has become corrupt, at least according to what the protagonist's detective board says. The word hideout definitely feels inaccurate by this point. You wouldn't call a CEO's headquarters their hideout. Perhaps a hideout is only the protagonist's perception of these locations. The tower opens with people who won't attack you, since Jinfeng is planning to meet the protagonist. It might take a second to realize that there's no need to beat these people up, which makes you think about the fact that any other living person you see in this game is perceived as a target for violence. It really connects the instincts that the game's been building up for the player with the mindset of the protag. It's also as soon as we get behind a closed door that the first fight happens. Afterwards, the elevator takes us instantly to where Jinfeng is. However, upon meeting her, she rings a bell and disappears. A possible interpretation is that Jinfeng actually tried to have a normal meeting with the protag, who then killed her right there, and the rest of the events of the tower never happen. Either way, this leads into an incredible infiltration sequence where we explore different parts of the tower while we hear the enemies trying to track us down. It feels like I'm playing Hitman or something, the way I'm stealthily approaching enemies. This part is so exciting and takes us to so many places, having us pull apart elevator doors with our bare hands, and having fights on top of an elevator whilst it's rapidly falling down the shaft. To get to the real boss fight, we have to go not up the tower, but downwards. The elevator falls for quite a while until we end up in some ancient underground ruins. By this point, our journey has gone completely off the wall insane, and yet this still comes as a shock, as half the entire level turns out to be some giant, decrepit, sprawling underground network. Falling into the depths may represent the protag descending into the depths of their own mind. The music is really boring though, it just sounds like some stereotypical creepy stuff, but nevertheless, throughout this section, there are these pulses of light that almost make it look like the surroundings are glitching, which is really interesting as it could be interpreted as the protag's reality breaking apart. The lore is expanded in no subtle way by having certain enemies monologue to us about how our father was part of a malicious group. So it's at this point that we learn that even the death of the protag's father may have not been entirely evil. At the end of the hideout, the protag jumps down what looks like a bottomless pit, showing in no unclear terms that they are essentially insane by this point. The battle with Jinfeng takes place in some sort of temple or grand hall which exists in this deep underground pretty conspicuously. In the second phase, Jinfeng smashes the floor, causing a mass of earth, making up the floor, to fall infinitely. It's a mystery as to how our protag makes it out of here, unless of course we take my interpretation that none of this actually happens. The tower has the most interesting use of something that I haven't talked about until now, which is the animation of what the protag is doing when they're back at the base after a hideout. Here, they're sitting at the edge of the bed and it looks like they're writhing. This is a sign of internal conflict. The protag is having to face the consequences of their actions. This display of emotion is particularly resonant coming right before the final level. The music in the sanctuary is ominous, but it should be clear by now that it's not the enemies that are threatening, but rather the protag. It also uses a motif to call back to a taste of revenge from the start of the game. The protag sees the act of coming to the sanctuary to fight Yang as the logical response to the events of the game's intro. You can read about where Yang's based from the start of the game on the detective board, and it'll tell you that the sanctuary is a place of traditional healing. In the beginning, since Yang is the antagonist, you might think that Yang has taken this place and twisted it into something worse, but by the time we arrive at it, it's clear that it's exactly what this place seems like on the surface. The sanctuary is a place of peace, and the protagonist will bring violence to this place. Here, there are people doing Tai Chi, getting massages, people in a kitchen, and other NPCs just chilling out, all of whom you're able to kill. Some enemies, before fighting you, will lecture you about finding your way. These people don't want conflict, but they want to help stop the protag's violent path. But perhaps the most surprising thing about this hideout so far is that nothing supernatural has happened. The game has been building up its surreal imagery slowly throughout the course of its story, and now suddenly it's been dropped. Perhaps because the protag has to face reality when facing Yang. Maybe this is the only thing that's real. There's certainly expansion on this idea yet to come in this level, though. However, for now, we must begin the fight against Yang. Speaking of, Yang's name, as you might recognize from the yin and yang, is a word associated with lightness, and as his sibling, that would make our protag yin. The protag is dark, Yang is light. We're on the wrong side. Often in stories, the antagonist is a dark reflection of the protag, but here, the protag is the dark reflection of him. And so we enter to take our revenge. Fearless, the final boss theme, uses the motif of Sifu's death. The protag coming in here to kill Yang is no worse than Yang's mistake of killing Sifu at the beginning of the game. The music draws this parallel between these two scenes. Yang is a master of Kung Fu. He's the only boss to use no weapon, and he doesn't need one, having learned all hand-to-hand techniques that the player possibly could have. In this way, he reflects the protag. You can't focus Yang, you have to play it fair. He's as strong as you could ever be, a true kung fu master, and if you're not too, you'll fall behind. He'll dodge anything you try to throw at him, and the only way to land hits is by responding to his attacks with a dodge or parry. Yang will sometimes stop and stand with his arms behind his back, ready for you. He plays fair, he doesn't need to use underhanded tactics. Throughout the fight, he taunts you, asking you to try harder like a teacher. He's not a villain. In the second phase, he throws you through a wall, and amazingly, it's night, it's raining, and you're back at the wuguan, the base of operations, specifically at the part where Yang killed Sifu in the opening. Having nothing supernatural happen throughout the entire level, only to present this striking image in the latter part of the final boss fight, makes this moment impactful. The scene suddenly shifting to that same night where Sifu was killed is an incredible choice of imagery that reflects the protagonist's perception of the fight. The setting here mirroring the death of Sifu signals the absolute focus the protagonist has on this one event of their father's death, one that they're dedicating their life to avenging. The parallels to the intro sequence are so strong, one vengeance to the next. Yang's second phase includes the Pak Mei, a technique you can never learn yourself, showing his true kung fu mastery over you. But if you can defeat his second phase, the protagonist will, once and for all, take their last revenge, and kill him in the same way he killed your father, a final parallel to the intro. But in doing so, they also get a vision from the talisman. We learn that Yang tried to steal the talisman to save his dying wife and child, also reflected by a statue earlier in the sanctuary representing his sorrow.
He who has Kung Fu and Wu De makes the other know he can break him. His hands go out like lightning, and the other doesn't want to fight anymore.
Yang was a man plagued by grief. He made a mistake and tried to rectify it by saving people's lives at the sanctuary. We've accomplished nothing by killing him. Except there is one thing to be learned from this experience. By replaying all the levels and using Wuda, you can reach the game's real ending. Wuda is the code of ethics in martial arts. If you break a boss's structure and weight, they'll heal a little bit of it, and if you can manage to break it again without killing them, you get the option to spare them. This is an effective use of the gameplay mechanics as a means to tell the story, allowing the player to non-lethally defeat enemies as a direct result of them engaging with the structure mechanic. Though the game never actually explains how to spare bosses, so you better hope someone told you how to do it. When I first played the game, I just assumed that inputting a takedown would result in the protag not killing the boss in the cutscene when fighting them on the second cycle. After all, most takedowns on normal enemies do not appear to kill them. So this can lead to some confusion and a muddling of clarity on how to use the mechanics to get the good ending. Sparing bosses also raises the question of, why does the protag kill droves of enemies on their way to each boss? If the protag adopts the code of Wuda and casts off their old ways of killing, it harms this aspect of the story. Nevertheless, we now have a brother to not kill. The Yang fight plays out the same until the end, in which Yang seizes the revival talisman and the scene shifts to the two graves. It's fitting to have the source of the entire conflict appear as the stage for the final battle. In this phase, there's no HP bar for either the player or Yang. As far as I know, you can't actually die, and that's fine to be honest, as all it does is it removes the stakes of the progress of the rest of the level, and this third phase is just extra. To win, you need to break its structure and do a takedown. The issue of the mechanic's messy link to sparing or killing enemies appears again here. You have to specifically not do a takedown in all other instances to spare, but then to beat Yang's final phase, you specifically do have to do a takedown, and then he gets spared in the cutscene. It's certainly confused and problematic. Anyways, Yang is spared, and the protag dies of their wounds since Yang took the talisman. So basically he killed us. I do question why Yang actually wants to kill the protag, why he says lines like, "I wouldn't have done that for you" when you spare him. Isn't he beyond his ways of killing? The Wuda route definitely isn't without its flaws. After the protag dies, they wake up in a cave and then ascend a mountain and see a dragon. So I guess they're in heaven or something for sparing everyone. Yippee, that's the end. I'm finally done talking about the goofy Wuda route. Sifu's story was unexpectedly great. Using little dialogue and a lot of interesting imagery, it effectively delivered a tale of revenge and forgiveness. The protagonist's morality becoming more obviously flawed as the game progressed was already engaging, but having the protagonist be delusional and ramping up the impossible visuals added a shocking twist that made it stand apart. The good ending was kinda messy, but all in all, the story still holds up. I've seen no one else read the game in this postmodern way, and people I've discussed with this have disagreed with my interpretation of the story. So I thought this would be a really interesting topic to talk about in a unique video on the story of Sifu. Yeah, I know this wasn't a JRPG or a turn-based game, and it wasn't a full critique of the game. It's kind of off-brand for me, but it's not like anyone cares. If you stuck around long enough for the whole thing, thank you very much. I appreciate you. Have a great life, and be cautious of revenge.